not an easy journey. And when you look back and remember those things, and also remember the people that you love, that you lost, and, you know.
Remember when Oliver Reed went on a drunken rant about where women should belong, and Shelly Winters had to put him in his place? That jaw-dropping moment is just one of many times The Tonight Show got a little too intense for live TV. From off-script outbursts to unexpected clashes and uncomfortable laughter, Johnny saw it all. In this video, we're diving into the most controversial guests Johnny Carson ever had. The ones who stirred the pot, crossed the line, or just made everyone in the room uncomfortable. 1. Marlon Brando.
A marvelous opportunity for an Indian to be able to voice his opinion to 85 million people. I guess that was the number.
Marlon Brando didn't just break the rules when he appeared on The Tonight Show. He rewrote them entirely. The legendary actor was infamous for showing up and doing exactly the opposite of what anyone expected. And his appearances with Johnny Carson became the stuff of television legend for all the strangest reasons. Brando was one of the biggest movie stars in the world, fresh off The Godfather and Last Tango in Paris, but he treated talk shows like his personal playground for chaos. When he sat down on Carson's couch, you genuinely had no idea what was going to happen. Would he actually talk about his movies? Would he cooperate at all? Would he turn the whole thing into some bizarre performance piece? The answer was usually the last option. But here's what made Brando so controversial. It wasn't that he was rude or mean. It was that he seemed to be making a point about the artificiality of the whole talk show format. He would refuse to give the easy answers that would make for smooth television. He would call out the phoniness of Hollywood promotion. He would essentially hold up a mirror to the entertainment industry and force everyone to look at how fake it all was. Some people found this brilliant and subversive. Others found it pretentious and insufferable. In one memorable appearance, Brando barely talked about his actual work at all. Instead, he went off on tangents about Native American rights, about the problems with Hollywood, about anything except what the producers wanted him to discuss. Johnny would try to steer the conversation back to safer territory, and Brando would just redirect it again. You could see Carson doing this delicate dance between being respectful to a legendary actor and trying to salvage the interview for his audience. Whether you thought Brando was a genius or just difficult probably said more about you than about him. But there's no denying that his appearances were controversial, talked about, and completely unforgettable. He made people question what they expected from celebrity interviews and why. He challenged the format itself, and in doing so, he created some of the most uncomfortable and fascinating television of his era. People are still debating whether his approach was brilliant or bratty, and that's exactly the kind of controversy that keeps his appearances relevant decades later. 2. Andy Kaufman.
I went on and I imitated Elvis Presley. They all thought, they were calling me, they said I was the comedy relief and the token white buffoon.
Nobody could ever figure out Andy Kaufman, and that was exactly the point. Every time he appeared on Carson's show, it was like watching someone from another planet try to understand human behavior. He would do things that made absolutely no sense to a traditional audience. He would read from The Great Gatsby in a monotone voice for minutes on end. He'd wrestle women on stage. He'd break into characters that nobody asked for and refused to break, no matter how uncomfortable everyone became. The controversy around Kaufman wasn't about politics or scandal. It was about whether what he was doing was even comedy at all. Half the audience thought he was a brilliant performance artist, pushing boundaries and challenging what entertainment could be. The other half thought he was wasting everyone's time and making a mockery of the show. There was almost no middle ground with Kaufman. You either got it or you absolutely didn't, and the people who didn't get it were furious about it. His appearances created this bizarre tension where you genuinely couldn't tell if he was joking or having some kind of breakdown on live television. He would argue with Johnny over nothing. He would refuse to promote his projects properly, instead going off on strange tangents that seemed designed to confuse rather than entertain. He'd do bits that went on way too long, past the point where anyone was laughing, into this uncomfortable territory where the audience didn't know how to react. One of his most infamous bits involved bringing out his bongos and singing children's songs in broken English, while doing this character called Foreign Man. It was awkward and strange, and just when the audience was completely turned off, he would suddenly break into a perfect Elvis impression. But even that felt like he was mocking them for falling for the setup. With Kaufman, you never knew if you were the audience or the punchline. He would also do things like challenge women to wrestling matches, which was controversial for completely different reasons. Some people thought it was funny in an absurdist way. Others thought it was degrading and sexist. Kaufman insisted it was performance art, that he was highlighting gender dynamics and challenging expectations. But he never actually explained it, so people were left to guess at his intentions, which only made the controversy worse. The thing about Kaufman was that he never broke character and never explained himself. He would show up, do something absolutely bizarre, and leave everyone scratching their heads. There were no post-show interviews where he would wink and say, "Gotcha." There was no acknowledgement that any of it was a joke. He treated his bits with complete seriousness, which made it impossible to know what was real and what was performance. Was he actually angry at Johnny? Was he genuinely that socially awkward? Or was the entire thing a carefully crafted piece of performance art? Looking back now, most people recognize him as a genius who was way ahead of his time. His influence can be seen in alternative comedy, in performance art, in anything that pushes boundaries and refuses to explain itself. But during those appearances, people were calling the network demanding to know what on earth they just watched and whether that guy was okay. Parents were concerned their kids were watching someone having a mental breakdown. Other viewers wondered if the whole thing was scripted and they were being made fun of for thinking it was real. 3. Muhammad Ali.
Yes, ain't nothing wrong with that music, but that fits the white culture. You go in our joints, oh baby, don't leave.
When Muhammad Ali walked onto Carson's stage, you knew you were in for something special and probably something controversial. Ali wasn't just a boxer. He was a cultural lightning rod who had strong opinions about everything from religion to race to war, and he wasn't afraid to share them on national television. His refusal to be drafted into the Vietnam War had already made him one of the most polarizing figures in America. Half the country saw him as a hero standing up for his beliefs. The other half saw him as unpatriotic and disrespectful. When he appeared on Carson's show, all of that tension came with him. Ali would sit on that couch and talk about Islam, about racial inequality, about his opposition to the war, and he'd do it all with this confidence and charisma that was absolutely magnetic. Johnny would try to keep things light, but Ali had a way of steering every conversation back to the issues he cared about. He wasn't there just to be entertaining. He was there to make people think and to challenge the status quo. What made these appearances so controversial was that Ali refused to play by the usual celebrity rules. He wouldn't just smile and tell funny stories about training camp. He would talk about white supremacy. He would discuss his religious conversion. He would defend positions that made a huge portion of Carson's audience deeply uncomfortable. The network would get complaints every single time. People would write letters saying they didn't want politics mixed with their entertainment. But here's the thing. Just as many people were calling to praise Ali for using his platform to speak truth. The controversy itself became part of the appeal. Even if you disagreed with everything Ali said, you couldn't stop watching because he was so compelling, so articulate, and so completely unafraid. 4. Truman Capote.
I wanted to go to Hollywood and be a professional tap dancer.
Truman Capote was the kind of guest who made you lean forward in your seat because you genuinely had no idea what was about to come out of his mouth. The brilliant author of In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's was also one of the most vicious gossips in American culture, and he used Carson's couch like his personal confessional. Capote would show up and just absolutely destroy people. He'd tell scandalous stories about celebrities, share secrets he probably shouldn't have known, and deliver cutting insults with this soft, almost innocent-sounding voice that made them somehow even more brutal. He'd talk about his famous friends and enemies with equal enthusiasm, never caring who he might be offending in the process. His flamboyant personality was also controversial for the time. This was an era when television was much more conservative, and Capote was unapologetically himself in every appearance. He spoke with that distinctive voice, made dramatic gestures, and didn't try to tone down any aspect of his personality for middle America watching at home. The feuds he discussed on air became legendary. He would mention people by name, share embarrassing stories, and generally act like the entire cultural elite was his personal reality show. Some viewers found him fascinating and hilarious. Others found him catty, mean-spirited, and inappropriate for family television. 5. Oliver Reed.
The hotel. He looked up and said, "What are you doing?" And Mooney says, "Answer the phone." He says, "All the radio's coming next."
If you want to talk about uncomfortable television, Oliver Reed's 1975 appearance is basically the gold standard. The British actor showed up to The Tonight Show absolutely drunk, and what followed was one of the most awkward, cringe-inducing interviews in late-night history. Reed was slurring his words, being aggressive toward Johnny, and generally acting like someone who had no business being on television at that moment. He kept trying to arm wrestle Carson, made inappropriate comments, and refused to follow the normal flow of conversation. It was clear to everyone watching that something was very wrong. Johnny, to his credit, tried to keep things professional and move past it. But Reed just kept getting worse. He'd lean in too close, speak too loud, and make everyone on set visibly uncomfortable. The audience didn't know whether to laugh or look away. The entire thing felt like watching a slow-motion car crash. The controversy came from the fact that the network let it happen at all. Why didn't someone stop the interview? Why did they let this guy on stage when he was clearly in no condition to be there? And why did they air it? People were outraged that this kind of behavior was broadcast into their living rooms, especially during a time slot when families might be watching together. Reed's appearance became infamous. It's still referenced today whenever people talk about disastrous television interviews. Some viewers felt bad for him, seeing a man struggling with addiction on display for entertainment. Others were angry at the whole production for letting it happen. Either way, it was a controversy that nobody could stop talking about, and it damaged both Reed's reputation and the show's squeaky clean image. 6. Gore Vidal.
Pundits on television were horrified. There was one who used to go on every night and say, "Where is outrage? Where is outrage?" Well,
Gore Vidal was brilliant, sophisticated, and absolutely loved stirring up trouble. The acclaimed novelist and essayist used his appearances on Carson's show to launch intellectual grenades at American culture, politics, and society. He wasn't there to make friends. He was there to make points, and he didn't care whose feathers he ruffled in the process. Vidal would show up and immediately start challenging assumptions. He would criticize American foreign policy, discuss sexuality in ways that made the audience uncomfortable, and generally act like he was too smart for the room, which, to be fair, he often was. But that intellectual superiority came across as arrogance to many viewers who felt like he was looking down on them. His public feuds were legendary, especially his decades-long battle with fellow writer William Buckley Jr. Vidal would reference these conflicts on Carson's show, reigniting controversies and making sure everyone knew exactly where he stood on every issue. He treated the interview like a debate platform, often leaving Johnny struggling to keep up with the intellectual pace. The controversy around Vidal wasn't just about what he said, but how he said it. He had this dismissive, condescending manner that made people either love him or absolutely hate him. Conservative viewers especially found him insufferable, seeing him as a smug elitist who enjoyed tearing down American values. Progressive viewers saw him as a brave truth-teller willing to challenge the establishment. Johnny seemed to genuinely enjoy sparring with Vidal, even when things got tense. Their exchanges had this electric quality where you could tell both men were sharp as knives, and neither was willing to back down. It made for compelling television, but it also made for countless angry phone calls to the network from viewers who felt like Vidal was using the show to push his agenda. 7. Don Rickles.
I'm 88 years old. Health is good, and I'm doing this because I enjoy it, and people show up to see me.
Don Rickles was a Carson favorite, and his insult comedy was usually a huge hit. But here's the thing about comedy that's based entirely on insulting people. Sometimes you cross a line, and Rickles crossed it more than once. His appearances would often start out funny and then gradually become more and more uncomfortable as he targeted people in the audience, other guests, and even Johnny himself with increasingly harsh jokes. What made it controversial was that you could never quite tell when he'd gone from playful roasting to genuinely hurtful comments. Rickles would make jokes about people's appearance, ethnicity, religion, and personal lives. In the 1960s and 70s, comedy had different boundaries than it does today, but even then, Rickles pushed things. He'd say things that would get gasps from the audience, and not always the good kind of gasps. Sometimes it was clear that people were genuinely offended. The controversy wasn't just about the jokes themselves. It was about whether this kind of humor had a place on family television. Parents would complain that their kids were watching someone be incredibly mean to people, and they weren't sure what kind of message that sent. Was it okay to insult people if you called it comedy? Johnny would sometimes try to rein Rickles in, but part of the act was that Rickles was uncontrollable. That was supposed to be funny, but it also meant that sometimes things went too far, and there was no taking it back. Some viewers loved the unpredictability and the edge. Others felt like he was just being cruel and hiding behind the label of comedian. Either way, his appearances always generated strong reactions, both positive and negative. 8. Madonna.
I wouldn't change my job as a parent for anything, but it's also extremely challenging.
When Madonna appeared on The Tonight Show in the 1980s, she was already known for pushing boundaries. But her appearance, where she dropped multiple curse words on live television, took things to another level entirely. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. Madonna seemed to deliberately use profanity throughout the interview, testing the limits of what she could get away with on network television. She'd casually drop words that would get censored, seemingly enjoying the shock value and the reaction she was getting from both Johnny and the audience. The network was flooded with complaints. This was during an era when television standards were much stricter than they are today, and hearing that kind of language during prime time was genuinely shocking to many viewers. Parents were furious that their kids might have heard it. Conservative groups called for boycotts. What made it even more controversial was that Madonna seemed to be doing it on purpose as part of her brand. She was the provocateur, the one who refused to play by the rules, and she was using Carson's show as a stage for that rebellion. Some people loved it and saw her as a feminist icon who refused to be controlled. Others saw her as disrespectful and attention-seeking. Johnny himself seemed caught between amusement and concern. He knew she was creating a moment, but he also knew his show was going to take heat for it. The careful dance between trying to keep things entertaining while also not completely alienating half his audience made for fascinating television. Madonna knew exactly what she was doing, and the controversy only helped her career. But it put The Tonight Show in an uncomfortable position that generated headlines for weeks. 9. Joan Rivers.
I am so happy when I'm performing. I am truly happy.
The Joan Rivers controversy wasn't about one specific appearance. It was about the entire relationship and how it fell apart in such a public, painful way. Rivers had been Carson's trusted guest host, the person who filled in when Johnny took time off. They had a genuine friendship, or so everyone thought. Then Rivers accepted an offer to host her own late-night show on Fox, competing directly with Carson. The way she handled it, or allegedly didn't handle it, depending on whose story you believe, resulted in Johnny feeling betrayed. He never spoke to her again, not once, for the rest of his life. This made every subsequent mention of Rivers on The Tonight Show controversial. The audience knew about the feud. They knew Carson was hurt. When Rivers' name came up, there was this tension in the air. Johnny wouldn't talk about her directly, but the silence itself was damning. The controversy split viewers. Some felt Rivers had every right to advance her career and that Carson was being petty and vindictive. Others felt she had been disloyal and that Carson had every right to cut her off. It became this cultural conversation about loyalty, business, friendship, and whether personal relationships should affect professional ones. What made it especially painful was that you could tell there was genuine hurt behind it. This wasn't a manufactured drama. This was two people who actually cared about each other having a falling out that never got resolved. Rivers talked about it in interviews, clearly hoping for reconciliation. Carson never budged. The sadness of it all made it controversial in a different way than the other entries on this list. Less shocking, more heartbreaking. 10. Bob Hope.
Oh, I got a line for you.
Yeah.
I was in Hays, Kansas. You know where that is?
Well,
Hays,
Bob Hope was an American institution, a comedy legend who appeared on Carson's show more than any other guest. So why is he on a list of controversial appearances? Because as time went on, the gap between Hope's old-school comedy and changing cultural attitudes became increasingly uncomfortable to watch. Hope's later appearances featured jokes that had worked fine in the 1950s, but sounded increasingly out of touch and offensive as the decades progressed. Jokes about women, about different ethnicities, about gay people. The kind of material that was considered standard comedy in his era, but made younger viewers in the 70s and 80s cringe. The controversy was subtle, but real. You'd have Johnny laughing because he was from the same generation and understood the context. But you could feel the audience's energy change. Younger viewers would watch and wonder why this was considered funny. Awkward silences would follow jokes that Hope clearly expected to land better. It created this uncomfortable dynamic where nobody wanted to criticize Bob Hope because he was Bob Hope. He was a legend. He had entertained troops for decades. He was beloved. But that didn't change the fact that his comedy style had become problematic, and The Tonight Show kept giving him airtime anyway. The controversy came later when people started looking back at these appearances and discussing how television had given a platform to material that really shouldn't have been broadcast. What all these moments share is that they made for unforgettable television. People are still talking about them decades later, still debating whether they were brilliant or awful, appropriate or offensive. That's the power of live television and the risk that comes with it. You never quite know what's going to happen when someone sits down on that couch, and sometimes what happens becomes history for all the wrong reasons.